Hello, everyone. Welcome to the awaited comeback of CryptoScam. I know it's been over a year since the last episode of CryptoScam, or close to a year, and I do apologize for that, but I am bringing back the podcast, and what better topic to bring the podcast back with than Ethereum. Ethereum was actually one of the reasons why this podcast kind of stopped. I intended through 4 parts of CryptoScam Ethereum, and I had a huge problem finding the right guests that were willing to discuss all of the problems involved in Ethereum. You saw me do the first episode on the Ethereum CryptoScam, which centered around the centralization of Ethereum from a regulatory perspective, as Jason Seibert and I talked about how it's an unlicensed, unregistered security. And Jason Seibert is, of course, a very esteemed securities lawyer. Here in part 2 of CryptoScam, we're going to zoom in on smart contracts and are they even needed? Like, what are smart contracts and what is Ethereum's value proposition for those smart contracts? And part 3, which I'm still looking for the right co-host, we're going to concentrate on the technology of Ethereum and why it can't scale technologically, ignoring the fact that they're an unlicensed security, ignoring the fact that no one actually needs the smart contracts, which we will discuss here. And we're just going to focus on their technological incapabilities. And then in part 4, we're going to talk about the economic side of it and focus in on the concept of the application token. So for this episode, my guest, the gentleman's name is Johnny Dilley. I have known Johnny Dilley for years. You may have seen him on my channel debating Roger Ver back at Anarchapulco 2016. 2017. In February 2017, he debated Roger Ver over big blocks. So one of the reasons why I grabbed Johnny Dilley for this interview is because I recently heard him on the Noted podcast, and he did an amazing job summing up Ethereum. I'm actually going to play that now, and just the last 10 to 12 minutes or so of the Noted podcast from approximately a month ago in early June. And then from there, Johnny will come on, and we're going to dive deeper into the concept of smart contracts and Ethereum.
All right, so I'm glad we got that rant in. So I love that. And now, without calling or without questioning the value of anyone's life, can we talk about Ethereum and the problems we have with Ethereum?
No. So look. I talk about this often. Like, I think that if Ethereum were to die in a fire today, okay, the world would be a better place. Okay. There'll be a lot of short-term pain, and I mean, I have a relationship with the SEC. Like, I tell them these things. Like, there will be a lot of pain today, but ultimately the world will be a better place. Why? One, it's the #1 platform in the world for scams. So, now, if you're going to say, hey, that's a good thing, ICOs are great. Sure, like, it is possible, it's feasible, it's very difficult, but it's possible and feasible for you to run a legitimate ICO. Legitimate in the sense of the same company could have raised money through normal venture capitalist means and has a chance of success resulting in the investors in that scheme having a return. Okay? The problem is the majority of these schemes that are being put on Ethereum have zero chance of returning any material value to anyone except for the founders of people who sold out their coins. Okay? None. Like, they are not business models that will survive. They are not business models that hold up to scrutiny. They are not business models that will ever be profitable. Why? Super, super, super simple. The majority of business models in the world are more efficient, more effective, cheaper, and easier to deliver to users when they're centralized. So why would you add distribution, decentralization, whatever that means, and a distributed means of delivering the same thing that right now is being delivered in a centralized fashion? Now, if your argument is, oh, it's great, no, it's competition, they're going to compete against these users. Okay, you can make some philosophical or economic argument that additional competitors in a space are going to be able to compete. But the problem is they're not even competing on the same footing. They've hampered themselves by adding a insulatory decentralized layer process in the way for their customers to actually get access to the product. So they haven't competed on the same footing. Like if you made a decentralized or distributed Lyft or Uber, you're not competing against Lyft and Uber. You're competing against other distributed Lyfts and Ubers, and Lyft and Uber crush the distributed Lyfts and Ubers because the cost basis is so much lower. Like you're never going to win. You're not going to be able to convince the user to use your distributed Lyft or your distributed Uber when the cost of using your distributed system is twice, 4 times, 10 times the cost basis. It just doesn't work. The only reason why Bitcoin makes any sense, because Bitcoin has tons of costs associated with distribution and censorship resistance, is because sound money is a useful thing to have strict rule adherence and distribution for censorship resistance. For the vast majority of business models, adding those two things, assuming you even get them with Ethereum, which you don't because they've demonstrated several times that they have no real interest in strict rule adherence. You don't actually even get those conditions necessarily, but adding those conditions to your business model to attempt to compete against centralized entities is it's dubious at best. Like it's just like what are you hoping for, guys? You hoping for some kind of decentralized revolution where the people like have a kumbaya and like sit up and, like we're all gonna triple our cost basis so we can disintermediate the middlemen. No, middlemen are convenient, middlemen are cheap, and middlemen have customer service. I don't buy it.
And so, with Ethereum being like a platform for all of these, would arguably are unregistered securities and whatnot, and people are buying ethers to then go buy their favorite ICO, and then the ICO sits on the ethers because they can't find developers to work on whatever they created, or, they can't get a banking relationship or anything like that. But how does this all unravel? Because we recently saw a post that made the point that it is already unraveling in the sense that the number of Ethereum nodes is dramatically dropping due to its inability, what we were talking about earlier, this doesn't scale unless you centralize. And that's kind of on the technical side, but we haven't seen that translate on the economic side into people having a crisis of confidence.
I'm seriously considering... because of my network, I'm actually seriously considering putting a lot of work into getting some FaceTime with the SEC so I can actually, sit and explain with them what's going on and why the system is a security and why it promotes securities or unregistered securities. I have to actually find the will and the effort to do that because, I have a life too. So like I'd have to like fly and like meet and like it's a huge pain, but I'm seriously considering it. I think if Ethereum or any of its major cohorts gets registered or gets classified as an unregistered security, I think the game ends or comes crashing down very rapidly. If Ethereum is classified as an unregistered security, it has to be delisted from all the exchanges globally in like 30 days, maybe 90 days. And that's just because the SEC has like the longest arm in the world. They will just arrest everyone. Like they'll just arrest everybody.
But don't we want this to fail on its own merits without having to have the government come in and shut it down?
So it will. Like the thing is it takes it. You have an informational asymmetry. So you have a system that's useless by design, okay? It's useful for one thing, prototyping how a blockchain might work in theory, okay? Or in hypothesis, okay? And then if you prototyped it and it was like, oh, wait, this might actually work, you would immediately never use Ether. You'd scrap it and start from scratch using like a strong federation, maybe Tendermint. Like you'd start from scratch and you'd build it in Rust or you'd build it in C++ and you would begin again and pay the money up front so you didn't trust a steaming pile of basically JavaScript, okay, with a whole bunch of, who knows. And so you aren't associated with that, kind of possible risk. So what use cases might actually hold up to that, and I always say that the only case where you actually need a blockchain is where there's many competitors who are sometimes counterparties. So there maybe are a handful of actual use cases to do that, but if what it's being used for, Ether right now in a lot of cases is what it's being used for is showcasing how internal IT upgrades or how security or infrastructure upgrades inside industries that are not blockchains but are inside industries, how they might be useful. That's not the purpose of this system. It's if the system's being used to prototype like how shipping can have like how shipping could be more efficient if they all use the same interface. There's no reason why the shipping industry would end up using Ether. It's like an expensive, ultimately hard capped, doesn't scale version of like a nightmare of the 1980s. Okay, there's no reason why it would end up using it. They might prototype it, but then if they have anyone with a brain, they're gonna be like, wait a second, why wouldn't we just roll something that's more secure and has better just computational trade-offs? So the information asymmetry there is the hype train that Vitalik and Evil Lubin started, is that they brainwashed or kind of they convinced a large enough group of people who were just technically savvy enough and just well connected enough to be in a position where they understood that this technology or technology in general had the potential to change things. They convinced them that the method of that change was going to be Ether, when in actuality, the underpinnings of reality make that impossible, okay? Or in the event that it does happen, it's a nightmarish future, okay? That trade-off, so the collapse condition where the undermining of that fable with the components of reality are the market's irrational. That could take years. That could take tens of years. So this is one condition where I am a major proponent of people stepping up and putting in the effort to actively undermine that system through whatever, but not through whatever means necessary. Or at least I wouldn't do it through whatever means necessary. But I'm a major proponent of it's you have an obligation to society, you have an obligation to your fellow man, your fellow woman, you have an obligation to your nation even to stop that which is not in your best interests. And we're talking about a system that is actively promoting scams, actively diluting people. People are walking around actively diluting people. Like they're profiting off the ignorance of others. And the fundamentals and the characteristics of the system don't speak to an actual improvement for anyone except for those who are selfish enough to take those means, to use those means. So I'm shocked that some people are so blasé or so passive against the the system continuing to do what it does. Like it's actively it's evil. Ethereum is an evil thing. It actively is undermining society. Like it's not a good thing. It's bad. It's so bad.
Well, it's facing competition now. So people are talking about EOS, which explicitly has 21 designated validators, and so you're just admitting it's going to be centralized, like XRP, and from the get-go, and you go that way. But so doesn't that mean that even if Ethereum gets shut down, we'll just have, like, obviously, this argument could be used against taking action against any evil, but other evils will crop up and continue to fill that information asymmetry.
So I'm fine with that. So like what will happen is Ether gets classified as an unregistered security. The foundation pays a fine. Vitalik, Lubin, and all the people who participated in it are banned for life from ever participating in the in registering a security or performing in an unregistered security action ever again. So now all the people that are Ether are banned from participating in raising money. Okay, thumbs up. Banned from being a director in a company ever again. Banned from participating on a board ever again. So done. Like those people are done. Like can no longer participate in the governance of a company or a distributed protocol ever again. The SEC can do that, which is amazing. Then you have the classification of Ether doing that. It then, not retroactively, but then the SEC can apply the same reasoning to all the other securities or all the other approaches that take the same approach. So EOS or whatever all get applied. Litecoin probably even happens to Litecoin, unfortunately. Maybe. And Monero maybe. And then what happens is you have with Zcash definitely. You have commiserate effects that occur as a result of the requirement that they be registered as security or be in non-compliance. All the exchanges have to change their dynamics as a result of the needing to be in compliance. And then the coup de grace, because the SEC, the CFTC, and the United States Treasury have all come out and stated that Bitcoin is not to be regulated by the CFTC or the SEC, Bitcoin's not subject to those conditions, and we go back to the game where it actually is, the actual reality, which is Bitcoin is the only, and then maybe Monero, and maybe Litecoin, the only attempt humanity is making at making a sound money, and all these other things are just companies, okay, which is actually what it is. So companies and the dynamics associated with companies and their specific products, and then the things trying to free humanity from an inflationary government-mandated future.
On that note, we'll close today's episode. I think that's perfect.
That's fine with me.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me. Appreciate having me.
Great. Hey, thanks for wanting to do this. I've actually been having a lot of problems finding people to, talk about the problems with Ethereum, because in general it tends to be bad for their career to talk bad about Ethereum, because somehow Ethereum they're running a company in the crypto space and they're not happy. So I'm really happy that you were able to come on. So tell my audience a little something about yourself. How long were you at Blockstream, and what you are currently up to, and what is your general expertise in the blockchain crypto space?
So I was at Blockstream for about 3 years. I spent 2 of that in the engineering group. Before that, for a year prior to the engineering group, I worked strategy and BD with Alex Fowler and Austin Hill. Before that, I spent 2 years at Pantera Capital with Steve Waterhouse, Dan Moorhead, and Paul Varadatakit. We built a pretty cool portfolio of companies and got in Bitcoin at like $62, and that was pretty profitable. And I've been in Bitcoin for 6-ish years at this point. Nowadays, I run a company called Mempool. Mempool Partners is the parent company that does architecture, technical consulting, due diligence, and basically cryptographic, risk analysis, stuff like that. We do a whole bunch of things. And yeah, I mean, I'm here. I think it's interesting that you say that a lot of people won't, get on screen or won't get FaceTime in to talk about Ethereum, when fundamentally it's one of the more interesting things to talk about, in the sense that it's so ridiculous. So I don't mind talking about technology. I don't mind talking about the system surrounding technology. So I have no problem talking about it.
All right, that's great. And as far as I know, I only have you 2 prior times to this podcast of being public. One of them is your recent appearance on the Noted podcast, and prior to that, you and I both debated Roger Ver at an Acapulco about 1.5 years ago on back-to-back days. So I will put both of those in this video description. If you have any other public appearances, please shoot over the links to me, and I will add them in as well. All right, so let's begin. So in episode one, you know what? Let's just briefly touch upon regulation. So in episode one of CryptoScam, Ethereum part one, I mean, me and Jason Seibert talked about Ethereum being an unlicensed, unregistered security. I know Jason Seibert was cursing up a storm the other day on my stream when, with the recent statements of the SEC, that they are, it looks like they're giving Ethereum a pass. It looks like they might say that Ethereum was a security, but for some reason they are not. What are your general views on Ethereum being a security? I mean, you've been around the finance space long enough. What do you think?
So for one, if you actually read the specific language the director used in his talk, he cages his statements by saying that based on my understanding of Ethereum, these things are the case. One of those being that Ethereum is decentralized when it's obviously not. So there's always the potential for re-education or just a further conversation with that director specifically. And you have to take the commentary that he gave with a grain of salt. That's not an official statement or an official position of the SEC. That's a statement from a specific director at the SEC. I mean, structurally, it's fundamentally obvious that it at the very least, when it was founded, was an unregistered security. The corporate structuring that the Ethereum Foundation used to try and get around this, it would, for any other normal thing, have been constituted as an unregistered raise subject to either Reg A or Reg D filing restrictions. And then as a result of that, you can make the argument that what follows from the poison tree remains poisoned, and as a result, the structural components that underwrite Ethereum now have the same characteristics from a securities perspective. I find that that's probably a reasonable argument, given that the network has both a topological component and a social political component that basically is determined by essentially a king or a king in his court, such that changes to Ethereum are done under fixed specific conditions, often outlined by Lubin or Vitalik. And that's not a system that's decentralized. That's a system with clear power structure that can be subject to subpoena or other kind of control schemes from a government. In comparison to, say, Bitcoin, where kind of chaotic consensus reigns.
Gotcha. All right. And just to close out on this, and I've mentioned this in another podcast when I was arguing with Bruce Fenton over this. Like, look, it is a lot of money was made in Ethereum. Like, again, you mentioned Joe Lubin, obviously Vitalik, many other people. So they are financially and freedom motivated to keep Ethereum from being a security. And they can throw a lot of money at, consultants. They can throw a lot of money at lobbyists, including Coin Center, that would then push the agenda that Ethereum is decentralized and that Ethereum is not a security. And it's not really like, I know I don't have the time to educate the SEC that Ethereum is centralized and not decentralized. And I don't even have the technical expertise to claim that I can properly educate them on that. And I would really like the Bitcoin core developers to continue developing on Bitcoin and not waste their time sitting in front of the SEC explaining to them that Ethereum is totally centralized from a technological perspective. So how does this, like you see how we're disadvantaged here in explaining the reality of the situation to a regulator that has a chance to do the right thing. They're going to do the wrong thing. They're going to screw up. Ethereum is going to continue to grow into this disaster until it implodes, and then people are going to scream, why didn't somebody do something? Why couldn't they know?
So you can make the argument that Bitcoin doesn't really care because it's not subject to the same kind of tenets or the same fundamentals. I mean, the crypto market itself will probably get hurt somewhat as a result, if that happens to come true. Majority of Bitcoin Core don't really, or people that are associated with Bitcoin Core don't really go out or get out that much. So I wouldn't worry about them spending time educating regulators or whatsoever. Like they're more interested in developing on something that has an opportunity for making humanity better, not just passively or personally, not just passively or personally enriching themselves. I think you'd be surprised. Sometimes regulators do get things right. It's not always them. They don't always screw it up. And the interesting thing about governments is they always have, as long as they remain in power, they always have the ability to reflexively go back on and change their decisions in light of new information. In the event that Ethereum did collapse, I would be very surprised if you didn't see people going to prison and people disallowed from participating as, directors of companies or ever allowed to fundraise ever again. So,
can some of them be prevented from programming ever again, like they do to hackers?
I mean, what do you mean by programming? Like, Ethereum's basically just like a distributed JavaScript engine with some gating functions. It's not really like it's not. It's not.
You don't give a lot of credit to the people programming the Ethereum underlying layer.
I would state that the caliber of programmer required to build a truly distributed system with fixed immutable rules is a whole nother league above those working on basically Python.
All right, so let's jump into the main topic for this Ethereum crypto scam part 2, which is the concept of decentralized Turing complete smart contracts. And I'm not sure Ethereum is Turing complete anymore, right? Didn't the DAO eliminate all Turing completeness after that disaster? Or because ERC20 tokens are not Turing complete by any means?
I mean, you shouldn't take the marketing verbatim used to describe what Ethereum does for what Ethereum actually is. I mean, Ethereum essentially now is just a mechanism for raising money for alternative projects. It's basically what it's used for, and liquidity on exchanges. That's the two things it's used for right now. We see this any actual use case. Like I think CryptoKittens was the biggest use of Ethereum ever, like actual use, and it's down 98.5% from its peak. Like it's not. There's no use of this system in the sense that, as we talked about before this, it's not really a system that, in the event that you have a fixed number of counterparties you need to do business with, you wouldn't necessarily subject yourself to the open rules of a public network because you're subsidizing other people's behaviors on the network and inherently exposing yourself to the risks of those other people on the same network. So you would just it's in your best interest as a business to make a tightly controlled private network instead of with potential interoperability with external networks than it does to run on a public network. So this was my critique in like 2014 about application tokens. There's no reason if you only need to periodically utilize an application layer, let's say Ethereum qualifies as an application layer, which it might not, but let's say it does, there'd be no reason to ever hold any Ether except under conditions where you do need to interoperate with external networks that also happen to be using Ether. So if you did the vast majority of your business amongst a fixed group of people, which is often how supply chains, general industries and stuff work, and then periodically you happen to have to do some business with someone outside of that network, you would then go to the open market or some sort of open network and process a transaction or process a mechanism by which you interact with this external party. You wouldn't sit there waiting it's not in your best interest to sit on an asset that exposes you to counterparty risk, exposes you to custodial risk, exposes you to price risk. There's a whole bunch of problems with sitting on application tokens. It's actually a major problem in a substantial number of business models in the ICO space as well.
The crypto scam episode, Ethereum part 4, is going to focus on the idiocracy of like the complete stupidity of application tokens and why they make no sense. So I completely agree with you there.
The vast majority of them make no sense. Some of them you can maybe make an argument that they might work, but most of them definitely.
Yeah, there's always some like fringe minor cases. And okay, to be more specific, I'm talking about application tokens that have an independent market speculative driven price. Like I understand why a Las Vegas casino needs an application token. I understand why airline miles have their own internal token, right? But those are generally pegged to something. They're not freely traded upon in the open market.
Yeah, it's service and utility dependent, obviously. So,
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah. So I mean, it's there's a lot we could unpack there, Tone.
Oh yeah, no, I know. That's why. Let's get back into the concept of smart contracts. So can you define? So Ethereum initially claimed to be Turing complete. Can you just define that for us? And like, are they actually still Turing complete? Because I don't think the ERC-20 tokens are. Because the DAO kind of eliminated that.
I mean, I think it's Turing complete up to the point where your contract runs out of money. Like, it can keep function calling and keep performing outputs and keep calling itself until it runs out of money. So, I mean, and in the sense that you happen to have enough money and the limitations around the economic rules of the system allow you to process specific kinds of outputs or inputs. Yes, like it structurally does, but there are obvious limitations based on the changes that the developer community of Ethereum mandated as a result of some of the exploits that the gray hats were running on the network, which is one of the problems why you can't sync a full node in Ethereum anymore.
Right, that's the technological issue of Ethereum, which I am going to explore in CryptoScam Ethereum Part 3. Now we can touch upon that as well. It's almost impossible to sync a node in Ethereum from scratch, right? Like getting every transaction from the first transaction up to the current transaction. You better be in Hong Kong or somewhere in San Francisco with like 300 or like a terabyte per second like bandwidth speed in order to download the data faster than it's being created on Ethereum right now.
It's the verification actually. That's the biggest issue.
Oh, is that the stupidity of having blocks every 12 seconds?
No, it's the that's inherently the stupidity of mandating that everyone in a network verify everyone else's entire contract.
Right. And this is the idea of why in the world do you have to decentralize smart contracts? Because to me, smart contracts is just a self-executing contract. A soda machine, and I see you've been drinking a soda, like if you bought that soda from a soda machine, that is a smart contract. Now, if you are really, really, paranoid and you don't want the government to know that you're buying a soda, something that the government should probably stop people from buying, but that's a different discussion. If you don't want the government to know that you're buying a soda, you can use, you're using cash, and the government doesn't know you're buying cash. And if the cash ever disappeared and you were forced to use a credit card to buy that soda, you now have Bitcoin as this anonymous decentralized value transfer. But Ethereum is trying to make a claim that that soda machine, that contract between you and the soda coming out of the machine needs to be decentralized, and that calculation would need to be recalculated not only by every node, but pretty much forever, every block, right?
So essentially, it's the idea that the entirety of every contract needs to be validated by everyone. Yes.
And perpetually, right? Not just once.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, yes.
Right. And and that's crazy, right? So everyone's coming up. So obviously no one has yet put soda machines on the Ethereum blockchain, but they have been trying to do, let's say, I mean, Airbnb is actually a debatable example, but something like Slockit, you entering somebody else's house through a smart lock, and that needs to be saved forever and ever and ever, recalculated by every node and stored for the history of time. And the question is, for what reason?
I mean, I understand the argument. It's so that you can have full validation of everything that's ever occurred ever. Maybe there's some merit in that, but there are horrendous costs associated with it that make it nonsensical. This is why Bitcoin validates just outputs, not the full script structure, which is super compelling. It's why things like the Lightning Network are super compelling, is it because you can have all these higher order script structures and arrangements occur between people in higher layers, and ultimately what's validated is just the settlement of a transaction, not the entirety of the whole interaction.
All right. And again, like I don't know how much we can talk about this, but to me, like the soda machine example is an example of a smart contract that clearly doesn't need to be decentralized. I can take it to the opposite extreme.
I mean, you have to be trustless. Like, it'd be great if it was trustless, but it doesn't need to be decentralized.
Right, but we're kind of okay trusting a soda machine. In fact, you want to trust that soda machine, right? Because if you put in $1 and your soda doesn't come out, in the world of Ethereum, what do?
No, you have Vitalik. Vitalik's an example.
All right. In the world where Vitalik eventually, like rage, has a nervous breakdown, which I wouldn't be surprised if he has. I mean, in a world where Vitalik isn't there, what do? Like, and again, we're talking about something bigger than. I'm going to talk about like Uber and Airbnb as well. But but anyway, that's the most simple smart contract that clearly doesn't need to be decentralized, because decentralization is a tool to prevent censorship. Would you agree?
That's one of the things you can gain from it. It's also a way of ensuring that everyone else is playing by the same rules. So it's not just for censorship resistance. Censorship resistance can be an example of it. But for example, you could have a censorship present network where everyone, which is decentralized in the sense that everyone's enforcing the same rule, a rule set across, various jurisdictions, but fundamentally meets some minimum distribution criteria such that it's sufficiently difficult to take the network down or to change the rules of the game for an outcome whereby everyone can validate everyone else's behaviors. So.
Gotcha. All right. So what I'm about to say could be very controversial. I have made this argument privately. I've never made this argument publicly, but here it is. To me, the soda machine is the simplest type of smart contract that Ethereum will tell you needs to be decentralized, and the majority of the world will tell you that it doesn't need to be. If you swing to the opposite extreme, what kind of a contract is at the highest risk of censorship resistance? And now we have to consider a contract that is illegal across the world, most of the world, 99.9% of the world. And now we're talking about something like a murder for hire contract and assassination contract.
I mean, it could be. I mean, there's other examples that aren't necessarily highly illegal, like extremely high value financial contracts can have the same kind of characteristics where the parties involved on the losing end of the contract, for example, would like to see the contract not faithfully executed, whereas those who are on the winning side of it would like to see it faithfully executed, and as a result, you have like this incentive structure problem. That the same incentive structure problem happens to also exist in those kinds of dark markets.
Yeah, I can see that on a very, very high level. Probably like what happened during the 2008 financial crash, when some of those credit default swap contracts were so massive that like the execution of some of those contracts, like literally like the big institutions that had a much bigger, standing with the U.S. government and regulators, were basically able to get around some of those executions, or at least delay them long enough for the firms that they owed money to like collapse. So I can definitely see it on that scale. And other than the illegal contracts of like the assassination that I mentioned. And so I can kind of see Ethereum being useful to decentralize those contracts. But like there is a giant gap between a soda machine and an assassination contract, or a giant like financial contract, massive enough to where you say, no. The losing party should not have the ability to use all the resources at their disposal to potentially change the laws to alter the outcome of that contract. And I see Ethereum's use case of decentralizing this to the need of the technology, like this massive energy output of the technology, and the fact that they may go proof of stake, which is a whole other debate. Even if you go proof of stake on a massive scale like Ethereum, that's still, you know, a lot of energy being used, not energy not by measuring electricity use, but a lot of energy of people running and storing all of that data. That's still a very like data and energy and financially expensive. So I can only see Ethereum be literally sitting just below these massive financial contracts and like illicit contracts. And there's not that many illicit contracts, guys. Like governments want contracts. Like governments encourage contracts of all kinds. It's commerce. Like the currency that you use for those contracts may be censored, but the contracts themselves are generally encouraged and not at risk of censorship.
I mean, so another problem you have is because the assets that you're describing external to the network aren't native to the system, your enforceability over the outcome requires, I can't really think about any condition that's like this, requires oracleization, which means you've introduced some degree of trust, either in a cross-network manner or with an underlying externally custodialized asset or some kind of externally verifiable or non-verifiable condition. So the introduction of trust in those scenarios just undermines a lot of the preconditions for why these things might be useful in the short to medium term. Until you actually have a massive amount of, you know, solely listed on one of these networks, like, so the assets themselves, the ownership is solely delineated on these networks, such that, you know, private key control on the network means actual control. Then you're going to have to exit to auxiliary legal or auxiliary settlement conditions anyway, which means you might as well have done whatever contractual arrangement was happening external to this network.
Right. No, I'm definitely with you there. So let's get into, you know, a lot of these projects, right? So which one you want to tackle? Airbnb, Uber, or supply chains? They're all the same.
I mean, so what's the Airbnb case? The argument is that you could load all of the houses into like this network. So you load all the property into this network. And then as a result of it being in the network, you can enter into contractual arrangements with people or other contracts such that like the cash flow for the asset is paid into the contract and then paid out to the user. Like I don't actually understand what I don't understand what you mean by the Airbnb case.
Well, the Airbnb case is that, I mean, Airbnb is a leech and they are a gross middleman that rips off both the homeowner and the user, and that this middleman of Airbnb needs to be eliminated so that you have a better flow of the business model directly from, you know, consumer to the producer.
I mean,
in this case is the renter.
You ever actually used Airbnb? I mean,
I've used it all the time.
Yeah. I mean, I don't quite understand that argument actually. Like, or at the very least, I think there's definitely some trade-offs. Like, fundamentally, centralization is usually a useful thing. Like, Airbnb does arbitration. Airbnb does fraud protection. Airbnb manages the money in escrow on your behalf. Like the centralized entity that provides the service in this case fulfills the interface between you, the user, the platform, the specific asset you're planning on leveraging for, you know, living or whatever, or staying somewhere, and then also happens to manage the interface on your behalf with, say, the government in the event that something bad happens, or the fire department in the event that something bad happens, the insurance company in the event that something bad happens. So having that centralized entity that's actually, that, you know, manages all those different conditions on your behalf actually cuts costs and raises efficiency in a lot of cases. Like if every property in the world was on Airbnb, okay, in such a manner that we understood specifically what Airbnb's cost was, okay? And every other property owner knew that every property was shared across them, was known in an area. Then competition has to occur inside that context. Now you can make the argument that Airbnb might choose some rent-seeking activity or as a monopoly set rents too high, but then the government can step in and be like, no, you're actually only
Well,
allowed.
Airbnb doesn't set the rate, the rent.
But Airbnb sets the rate for what they take as a service charge.
Oh, their fee. Yeah. I agree.
So in the event that Airbnb became a monopoly, okay, the government could step in and be like, all right, fine, we have a natural monopoly in property provisioning, which we don't. I don't think we ever will. But we have a natural monopoly in property provisioning. As a result, we're going to fix the profit rates that this company can actually earn as a result of being a corporation and still get the gains from it being a centralization, efficiency vector. So I don't necessarily buy the Airbnb case because the pain, let alone what network you build for facilitating the contracting arrangements, faithful contracting arrangements between people such that they can rent one another's property, discovery of those people and all that process. The pain, the bootstrapping of that system, the costs associated with the bootstrapping of that system for any given user, maybe even any given class of users, is probably not even worth it. You're actually probably losing money as a result of the time and the relative in supply on the competing network. It's like it doesn't make any sense unless you think the government can't impose conditions that limit the monopoly rent-seeking behaviors of Airbnb.
Right. No, I agree with you there. So I was clearly, I think the Airbnb or the Uber case in a decentralized form would be totally insane. However, I will say that they could work in areas where Airbnb or Uber is illegal, right? Like then it becomes your only option, and you're willing to take on the risk of not having that middleman that is helping you. And
so you're a user breaking the law.
Correct. Well, both, right? The user, probably the renter, is breaking the law. The user can probably get away with it, but certainly the renter is breaking the law, and you're willing to take that on. I will say the only other cases, like Airbnb used to be a lot better before the government mandated Airbnb to collect taxes. And then Airbnb was not all that much more competitive than hotels when they started taking taxes. But again, that's something that you have to deal with. And you can also, try and petition your local government or your state government in order to, drop those taxes, and maybe drop those taxes on hotels as well. But yeah, so
I mean, if you're going to advocate that the use case for the Airbnb system is local regulatory arbitrage to evade taxes, you're going to have a hard time keeping your business around.
Well, and that's the thing, right? People don't realize that it's a business, right? If you start out creating a decentralized Airbnb, do you watch Silicon Valley?
I have not seen the most recent season.
Oh, okay. So I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it's the same concept, right? If you're going to set out and you're going to build a decentralized Uber, so first of all, you have to ICO because no VC is dumb enough to give you money. But if you're going to decentralize Uber, you are the company, right? You're still the Uber, right? You're still responsible for that underlying code.
Now you can potentially build hardware delineated networks that have strict governance, mechanical governance structures that still pay you as the creator of the network while you no longer being in control. But that's very difficult.
That's difficult. And that's also, try explaining that in a court of law. That you're collecting money, you're collecting a fee from every transaction, but yet you have no control of the system.
Yeah, I mean, you'll probably go to jail.
Like you can't win, and that's what I tell these people. If you succeed, you will fail, and no one will care about you personally. You're not going to be Ross Ulbricht. you don't get that many very, very
I mean,
often.
there's also the problem that a lot of these networks aren't really particularly designed with hardcore resilience in mind. So, like shutting them down is trivial if you're a large enough state actor.
Right. And the only way you can get away with it is if you built this system and not collect fees going forward. Kind of like Bitcoin, right? Where the majority of Bitcoin contributors to the code don't actually get paid, right? There is a handful of developers at Blockstream, a handful of developers at Chainco Labs. You know, maybe one or two other people are randomly sponsored by other by initiative, but the majority of the people are volunteering. Now, they're volunteering. A lot of them, you know, just want to work on a project. Some of them are heavily invested in Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is the native currency of the Bitcoin blockchain. It has to be that way because it's trying to be better money. Now, these things, this is why a lot of them end up ICOing to decentralize this. And at the end of the day, how are you going to get the necessary brain power to fix a bug in the future of a decentralized Uber? Because it's not going to work on an inherent Uber token. It's going to work as Bitcoin, as the medium of exchange that everyone is going to have in the future to run a decentralized Airbnb. So where is the incentive to fix a major problem? If a major problem arises, you're totally screwed.
Well, I mean, we might get to test this hypothesis with, companies like EOS and Telegram raising billions. So
wait, are we gonna test anything in EOS other than like how to get the system up and running?
I mean, I don't keep up to date on them. I just know that they have certain goals. Whether or not they're feasible, even with that amount of money, I'm not sure. So
Man, ever since Ethereum,
I don't spend a lot of time thinking about them. So,
I think the most successful projects since Ethereum have been trying to build a better version of Ethereum. So we have.
You can make that argument, sure.
Yeah. Because nothing built on Ethereum is useful. So the next thing is, you know, EOS and, Tezos never actually launched, but Cardano and Waves was, you know, in the news for a little while. Everyone is trying to just build a better Ethereum. Ethereum Classic is still around. What do you think of Ethereum Classic?
I mean, it's got slightly better morality than Ethereum. So I don't really know what. It's not. I don't really have a perspective on the asset. I don't trade, so that's not my purview. So I mean, I like, you got to keep in mind, I don't particularly care about any of these other projects. Like, in the event that they happen to attempt to state things that's false about them, I'll spend the time and in such a manner that it affects my business or it affects Bitcoin. Like, I sometimes take the time to go out of my way to learn about them such that I can refute those statements. But often I just find that these are people just looking to get wealthy the fastest way possible.
Well, yeah, that's how I feel about the entire space. Want to touch upon maybe supply chains being decentralized, through Ethereum, and is there any kind of
Ethereum? No, definitely not. Now, strong distribution along supply chain where you get enforcement of laws and governance as a result of a fixed mechanical hardware solution, sure, I'm on board. But you don't get that guarantee from Ethereum. Now, if we're gonna talk about like the potential for governments to start loading law enforcement and mechanical rules around trade into these kinds of systems that have strict rule adherence and consequences for violating the rules, then sure, like that's interesting. But that's not what we're talking about. Like, we're talking about companies creating parallel ledgers when the actual shit's also running in their main and their other old system, their main system. They're not talking about moving their whole business inside this, monstrosity. They're just testing to see if they get, if they get a better Excel spreadsheet out of it. You don't get any actual gain from it. Not any more that you would gain from, having one or two companies sharing the same, rule mediated Excel spreadsheet. But if you were talking about 5, 6, 7, 10 governments deciding that trade rules amongst them and the mechanics for those trade rules are all loaded into hardware-specific mechanized structures, then you can start to see some interesting things come from that. But that's very different than what we're talking about right now.
Right. So, so the view is, if Ethereum, if you can get a bunch of companies to use the Ethereum blockchain, how quickly will they all just get on a conference call and going, why the hell are we using this ridiculousness plus its currency? Why can't we just take the open source code and build something we all share as one database?
Well, I mean, I agree with Jimmy Song here when he spoke on stage of consensus. There's no evidence anyone's building anything on this. Not anything they're going to use. Like, it's a bunch of people all talking about how they're building these platforms for people to use, but fundamentally it's a solution looking for problems. Like, just without a structural change in the way in which laws are enforced, or the way in which laws are made, or the way in which companies choose to interact with one another as groups, you're just going to fundamentally get to the same place that R3's at right now, which is, oh, wait a second. You're telling me that companies don't want to cut their profits to slightly improve the global efficiency for everyone else? Who would have thought? Like, you face this disjointed problem, and coordinating companies is extremely difficult. Where the coordination costs and the efficiency costs to distributing these business models is higher than the price people are willing to pay for their IT upgrades. So it's just not fundamentally interesting for the majority of challenges. And a lot of the companies that are asking me for help right now and asking me for architectural designs and such, a lot of the challenges they need don't require what Jimmy loves talking about this, what require a blockchain. They required like some degree of applied cryptography and then someone to figure out the coordination challenges of the industry. They don't require this open platform. They don't require all these rules. They require really simple, straightforward, applied cryptography rule sets, mechanically enforced via hardware, and mechanisms by which, they can agree to changes in the rules. That's what companies want. Like, they don't need this, flowery world computer vision that Vitalik has, spun. They want an IT upgrade.
All right. So what happens next? Like, what do you think? I mean, we can touch upon. I mean, the floor is yours now. I mean, I know it technologically can't scale, but I mean, they got all these great grant plans between sharding and potentially going to proof of stake. I don't know how in the world they can go to proof of stake. Their miners are making a lot of money.
I actually take the stance that you just shouldn't talk about it. Like, why are we talking about it? It's kind of boring. Unless you're talking about how you're going to raise money on ERC20, sure. Like, cool, bro. Congrats. You're going to have a smart contract. We're going to pay you in Ether, and you're going to convert it to USD so you have a bank account. Assuming you can get a bank account because you're an ICO. Like, it's not interesting. Like, it's fun. It's fundamentally not a particularly interesting project. It's like a misbehaving toy. Like, so it's not I don't know. Like, so I just take the approach to, like, I just don't talk about it. Like I really don't.
Gotcha. Oh, here's the thing I was going to say before. So if you are one of these companies that is building something using Ethereum and you're trying to sell it to a client, you almost have to keep a record of every transaction locally. You can't trust Ethereum and outsource all of your transactions, especially when there's potentially real money on the line, because those transactions can disappear. Like, how do people blindly trust Ethereum and that the record is going to be there?
I mean, I would just ask you, like, what business model are you talking about, Tone? Who are these companies? Like,
well, any of them. Let's take Civic, for example, right? They seem to be pretty popular out in San Francisco. Vinny Lingham's company doing identities. They're using an ERC20 token. I don't know what the hell they need a token for. I mean, Vinny tried to explain this to me several times. I still don't understand why they need their own token. But every transaction with that token is stored in the Ethereum, global world computer. don't Civic have to keep a record of every one of those transactions locally? You can't trust Ethereum to be there in a year.
So they're using Ethereum for a timestamped audit log? Oracle's been doing that for 30 years.
Yes. I mean, so has Excel. You know, I can always go and take a look when I entered something into a cell.
If that's the use case, that's hilarious. Like, okay, thanks for reinventing Oracle's business model. No, I mean, I don't know. I don't understand the specifics of Civic's identity solution or whatever they're calling it. I advise an identity company called the Shift Network, SHYFT.network. And I help design some of their systems architecture and stuff. And the ultimate goal for any of these systems that actually have a business model, and I actually do think compliance and KYC AML for legitimate transactions might have some room, because there is some improvements. There is an IT upgrade that's required for the distribution across the banks. So they might actually be willing to pay, for example, $5 for a validated transaction when it comes to getting good identity information. If the cost right now is $10, they might pay that. They might be willing to pay that money. Whether or not that's a good thing, it depends on the transaction and what we're talking about. I mean, fundamentally, those networks that are run by companies that want to minimize their security risks and improve their distribution such that it's difficult for the company for the technology component or the company to get taken down, the best you can do is just strong distribution via a hardware methodology. So using a time-stamped audit log, which is what you're saying they're doing, is kind of like, okay, cool, congrats. Like you have a time-stamped audit log. There are hundreds of companies that do that. You could equally use Bitcoin to do that. Facilitating that service doesn't make your service valuable. Like, it's a thing you can do. It is a service you can provide. But if your actual business model isn't a business model, that's not what makes a business model. Timestamp.
All right, so where do you think this goes next? I mean, I know I've been wrong. I didn't think Ethereum would make it this long. I didn't even think Ethereum was going to launch. So how bad can this get? Like, where do you think this is going? Like, what do you think the future is for that entire, Ethereum/ICO world?
I mean, the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent.
Yeah, thank God I haven't bet against Ethereum yet. I would not be solvent by now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a lot we can talk about. I mean, I'm kind of on the same page with Jimmy. It's like I'd like to see a business model that works. Like they lauded
other than consulting. I mean, Consensus has like 800 employees, and they consult in the Ethereum world.
Oh, and they get paid handsomely.
Oh yeah, I can imagine. I mean, like even like 6-7 months ago, I was meeting like interns. Like there's universities that are giving college credit to these students that go and like intern at Consensus. I mean, it's out of control.
I mean, Tone, if you analyze every bubble in history, the same kind of mania persisted. Like I just think the majority of the people are forgetting that the mania will end at some point. I don't know the timing on that. Like,
I'm fully aware. I have one of the presentations that I do around the world is called the Inevitable ICO Bubble, and I just compare these ICOs to the .coms of the late 90s.
So, I mean, you can for a lot of them. That's probably true, and some companies in the late 90s did make it, but structurally, a lot of business in New York, San Francisco, Austin, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Germany, the UK. Everyone forgets that in 20 years, we're still going to be doing business together. We're all still going to be here, okay? And we're all still going to be working. And if you torched your reputation by building a fucking company that does decentralized locks, okay? Because you thought that was going to be the future, and it blew up in your face, and this is true for hundreds, if not thousands, of business models in our case, in the industry now. What will happen is there'll be at some point the industry will fail. The majority of companies will fail in the same kind of way that the dot-com bubble mania, the bond bubble mania, the property manias have all happened. And then you have a bunch of unemployed people with skills that are useless. And then they don't really participate in the market anymore. And in a lot of cases, they're actually removed from the market permanently, in the sense that governments come and enforce action upon them because they made incorrect claims to their clients, or violated some myriad of laws as a result of their approach. So I choose to not really let that worry me. I think fundamentally you have an obligation to try and help people to avoid scams. So part of what my business does.
Right. Yeah. That's what this podcast does. That's what my YouTube channel tries to do.
Yeah.
I think I've convinced enough people to slowly become understanding the difference between Bitcoin and everything else. There's a big difference there.
Yeah, I think the worst case scenario in the inevitable blowback is the blowback also affects Bitcoin, but I think Bitcoin's fundamentals will it'll allow it to weather that. I'm not worried about Bitcoin's health in the long run from that.
Yeah, no, I agree there as well. Okay, so we're coming up on an hour, so we're gonna close out. You want to touch upon the technology of Ethereum and their inability to scale technologically. Throw your thoughts on that for the viewers.
I mean, if they make the trade-offs that Vitalik and Vlad and they all talk about, sure, you can make trade-offs to make it scale, but is the system interesting as a result of the fact that you made those trade-offs? And that's even setting aside the fact that the system in its current state. Okay, so I mean, sure, you can increase the trust requirements of the system, and as a result of increasing the trust requirements of the system, get additional scale. Congratulations, cool. That's not interesting. That's a huge component of what underwrote the block size debate in Bitcoin. It's not interesting if you change the topology or the characteristics of the network. I'd say that the design of the system as it is now definitely can't scale. We saw that with CryptoKitties. One application having any use flooded their whole network. And I would say that from a political and also technological stance, if you actually can enforce the hard fork rule structure via any kind of kingly or other consensus method that's force mediated, then the system is certainly uninteresting. It represents a central point of control.
Gotcha. All right. On this note, I guess we can go ahead and end this episode. This was CryptoScam Ethereum Part 2, where we tried to explain the inefficiency of putting everything into decentralized smart contracts. And I usually, separate decentralized smart contracts from smart contracts, because there's nothing wrong with self-executing contracts, again, like a soda machine. But when you start to decentralize it, you realize the technological expense that's involved, and you have to realize what is actually in need of decentralization and what isn't. I'd like to thank Johnny Dilley for coming on and helping me out and helping me walk you through this. Johnny, tell my audience where people can find more of your work or find you.
I mean, you can Google me if you want, but you probably won't be able to get in touch with me. If you know somebody that knows me, you might be able to get in touch with me, but please only do so if you really need my help.
Oh yeah, and don't count me. I can barely get a hold of them. We don't exactly use the same communication apps. But yeah, so Johnny, and your consulting company is?
Mempool.
All right, so check it out. And hey, thanks so much for joining me on this episode. And hey guys, so thank you so much for once again watching another episode of CryptoScam. I am bringing back the show. I'm going to come up with more creative guests. I'm going to try to finally close out Ethereum and then try to go after some other projects. I don't know, maybe Factom's still around. That was the initial plan. I definitely want to talk about cloud mining and some of the other projects going on in the crypto space. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you all on the next episode of CryptoScam.